The white mansion loomed at the end of the long, winding driveway, its once pristine exterior now dull in the morning light. It was an imposing house, with towering columns, a wide porch, and large windows that offered a view of the surrounding estate. A place that had been filled with joy, laughter, and life, was now eerily quiet, almost suffocating. No sounds of children playing in the yard, no voices of Clara and Alexander Porter discussing their dreams for the future, just the soft creak of the wooden steps beneath Alexander's weight. He sat there on the front porch, his shoulders slumped, his body physically present but emotionally far away. The heat of the midday sun beat down on him, but he barely felt it. His crisp pink dress shirt, once immaculate, was now wrinkled and stained with tears and sweat. His black trousers were too stiff against his legs, but he didn't care. His hands trembled as they rested on his knees, fingers twitching as if they were searching for something to hold on to, something to anchor him in the storm of grief that had overtaken his life. But there was nothing. Before him, on the porch, lay a small wooden coffin. Its polished surface gleamed faintly in the light, but the tiny body inside his son, Benjamin, was as still as the world around him, wrapped tightly in a pale blanket. The child looked serene, untouched by the chaos of the world. To any observer, it might have seemed like an ordinary funeral scene, but for Alexander, it was nothing short of a nightmare. His son, the child he and Clara had dreamed of for so many years, the child that was supposed to be their miracle, was gone. A void had opened up within him, a hollow, unbearable emptiness that no amount of wealth, success, or achievements could ever fill. He had been on top of the world just a few days ago, the proud owner of one of the most successful real estate firms in the city, yet now, nothing mattered. His success had been meaningless. His riches, empty. The memory of Clara's final smile haunted him. The hospital room, the sterile white walls, the cold sound of the doctor's voice, informing him of the tragic news. "Your wife didn't make it." The words echoed in his ears, louder than any siren. He had collapsed in that hospital hallway, but nothing could prepare him for the moment when he had to ask the most painful question of his life. "And the baby?" he had whispered, hoping against all hope for a miracle. The answer had come swiftly, like a punch to the gut. He was born, but only for a few moments. "We did everything we could." Alexander had never felt more alone than in that moment. His mind had spun out of control. How could this happen? Why had it happened to him? The one thing he had longed for, worked for his family, had been stolen from him in an instant. The hope of a child, the dream of a life together with Clara and their son, had evaporated like smoke in the wind. For days, Alexander had wandered in a fog, unable to move forward, unable to face the world outside his mansion. The funeral had been arranged quickly, and yet Alexander couldn't bring himself to allow his son's body to leave the house. The idea of strangers handling his child was unbearable. So, instead, he had placed the small coffin on the porch, beside where Clara used to sit in the evenings, her hand resting on her growing belly as they talked about their hopes for the future. But now, that future was gone, replaced by the weight of loss and regret. Alexander had never felt more disconnected from the world. The day that had been meant to mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with joy, love, and laughter, had instead become a nightmare. Alexander had been pacing nervously in the sterile hospital hallway, awaiting any word on Clara's condition. His heart had been racing as the minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. He had imagined this moment so many times in his mind, holding his newborn son, seeing Clara's face light up with happiness as they became a family. But the reality had shattered those dreams in an instant. Clara had been in labor for hours. There had been complications, the doctors had said. The heart monitor had begun to beep erratically. Panic had set in. The medical staff scrambled to stabilize Clara, rushing her into surgery to save both mother and child. Alexander had remained outside, his stomach twisting with each passing minute. He had tried to stay calm, but the fear had been overwhelming. He paced the hallway, waiting for any sign that everything would be okay. But when the doctor finally emerged, the look on his face was enough. It wasn't just the sadness in his eyes that made Alexander's blood run cold. It was the resignation, the sense that the worst had already happened. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Porter," the doctor had said, his voice soft but firm. "Your wife didn't make it." In that instant, Alexander's legs had given way beneath him. He had crumpled to the floor, his world spinning, as the harsh reality of what had just happened settled over him like a dark cloud. His heart had felt as if it had been ripped out of his chest. How could this be happening? How could he lose Clara, the love of his life, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin? And worse still, how could he lose their baby, their son, their miracle? His throat had tightened, and the words had come out in a strangled whisper. "And the baby?" The doctor had hesitated, looking down at the ground, avoiding Alexander's desperate gaze. "He was born, but only for a few moments. We did everything we could. I'm so sorry." The room had spun, and Alexander had to brace himself against the wall. He had felt the world around him collapse in slow motion. He had lost Clara, he had lost their baby, and in a single, devastating moment. His life had gone from one of promise and excitement to nothing but pain and loss. In the aftermath of the tragedy, everything had become a blur. The funeral arrangements had been made quickly, as if everyone around him had known what to do, except for him. Alexander hadn't been able to make decisions. He hadn't been able to think straight. The pain had been too much to bear. But there was one thing he was sure of: he couldn't let go of his son. Not just yet. He couldn't bear the thought of his baby being taken to a funeral home, handled by strangers, placed in a cold, sterile room. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. He wanted to keep his son at home, in the place where he had hoped to raise him. He wanted to be close to him, just a little longer. So, he arranged for the coffin to be placed on the porch, under the roof where Clara had once rocked in the evenings, dreaming of their child. The memory of those dreams was too painful, but he couldn't bring himself to part with the child they had both longed for so desperately. Days passed, but Alexander didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring blankly at the coffin, lost in his thoughts. The house, once so full of life and excitement, was now silent and still. The life that had once seemed so full of promise had been stolen from him. The dreams of raising his son, watching him grow, and seeing Clara's face light up with pride had all been shattered. And yet, Alexander couldn't move. He couldn't leave. He couldn't say goodbye yet. As the hours passed, he sat on the porch, frozen in place, his hands trembling, his heart aching with every breath he took. Time seemed to stand still, and in the silence, his grief consumed him. As Alexander sat on the porch, lost in his sorrow, he didn't notice the small figure approaching the house. A young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, appeared from the street. His skin was dark, his clothes ragged and torn, his bare feet caked in dirt. He was a child who had clearly known hardship, a child who was used to being overlooked, ignored by society. The boy paused at the end of the driveway, looking up at the imposing house. He didn't belong here, not in this grand estate, with its pristine lawn and perfect facade, but something had caught his attention. The coffin on the porch. Drawn by some invisible force, the boy crept closer, his bare feet barely making a sound on the ground. He stood at the edge of the porch, his eyes wide with curiosity. He stared down at the tiny body swaddled in the blanket, its stillness speaking volumes to the boy. But there was something about it, something strange. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a pull, a sense that things weren't as they seemed. The boy moved closer, squatting down to get a better look. He stared at the baby for a moment, his heart racing, before something caught his eye. The baby's chest. It moved. Eli blinked. His small hands rubbed his eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Had he imagined it? No. He looked again, squinting in the harsh sunlight. There it was, again, a faint rise and fall. The baby's chest moved, ever so slightly, as if there was the faintest breath. Eli's heart raced as he stared, mesmerized by the movement. He wasn't sure what to do, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't normal. He had seen death before. He had seen people pass away. He knew the stillness that came with it. But this was different. He took a step back, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. There was no doubt in his young mind. The baby was alive. Without thinking, Eli turned and hurried up the porch steps, his voice trembling as he called out to the man sitting motionless on the steps. Mister, he shouted, your baby, ... he's alive. The words were simple, but they carried with them a sense of urgency, of hope, and of something that Alexander had lost sight of, a flicker of life where there had only been death. Alexander didn't hear the boy at first. Thought the words drifted through the thick fog of grief in his mind like faint echoes. Mister, ... your baby. He's alive. He barely blinked. His mind was so consumed by sorrow, so buried in despair, that it didn't register. The pain was too heavy, the silence too loud. But then again, more urgent this time. Mister, please. I saw him move. He's breathing. Alexander's blood turned cold. The voice wasn't imagined. It was real. A young voice, full of urgency. He turned slowly, his eyes heavy and red-rimmed, and saw the boy, thin, small, barefoot, standing a few feet away, pointing at the tiny coffin. What, ... did you say? Alexander croaked, unsure if his ears had deceived him. I saw your baby's chest move. The boy said again, stepping forward. He's not dead. I swear, he's breathing. Alexander's heart stuttered in his chest. No, impossible. The doctors had confirmed it. He had held his lifeless son in the hospital room, had watched them cover his small body. They had signed the death certificate. The world had gone quiet. But the conviction in the boy's voice was unnerving. Something in his tone, clear, sincere, unshaken, pierced through the fog like a bell. A child had nothing to gain from such a claim. There was no deception in his wide, frightened eyes. Alexander turned back toward the casket with trembling hands. He leaned down, barely able to breathe, and stared into it. And there it was. The smallest, most fragile movement, almost invisible but undeniable. The baby's chest lifted ever so gently, then fell, Alexander's breath caught in his throat, leaned in further, his face just inches from the child, and watched as the faintest trace of life fluttered beneath the blanket. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached out and brushed the baby's cheek. It was not cold, not stiff, it was soft. Warm. Tears welled in his eyes, different this time, not just from sorrow, from disbelief, from a sudden surge of hope. No, he whispered. Oh God, ... No, no, ... please yes. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees beside the coffin, sobbing. Not from grief, but from the possibility, however, slim, that this nightmare wasn't over in the way he thought. The impossible was unfolding in front of him. His son Benjamin, whom he had mourned for days, was alive. He spun around, staring at the little boy. Stay here, he said hoarsely, his voice shaking. Don't move. Alexander fumbled for his phone, hands slick with sweat. His fingers wouldn't move fast enough. The numbers blurred. But finally, he managed to press the emergency button. 911. What's your emergency? My baby is alive, he cried. My baby, he's breathing, he's alive. Please, send an ambulance. Now. The dispatcher asked questions, but Alexander could barely speak through the adrenaline coursing through him. All he could do was cradle the tiny blanket in his arms and whisper to the still-moving child, hold on, please, just hold on. Behind him, the bio stood motionless, his eyes wide, watching as everything changed in a heartbeat. Within minutes, the sharp, high-pitched sound of sirens cut through the silence of the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed wildly against the white siding of the house as the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the gate. The sound jolted Alexander to his feet. He ran toward them, waving frantically. Here, he shouted. The paramedics leaped into action. A woman with a medical kit and a tall man pushing a stretcher ran up the steps. Where is the baby? One asked urgently. In the coffin, he's alive, he's breathing, Alexander shouted, barely able to get the words out. The paramedics paused just long enough to register the surreal sign, a tiny wooden casket on a mansion porch, and a man pale and shaking pointing at it. Then they acted. One gently lifted the baby while the other pulled out a stethoscope and oxygen mask. We've got a weak pulse, the man confirmed. Airways clear. Administering oxygen now, the woman said. Her hands moved quickly but gently, securing the mask to the baby's face and checking vitals. The older paramedic looked at Alexander. You said the baby was declared dead. Alexander nodded, unable to speak. We don't have time to waste, the woman said. Let's go. They moved with incredible speed. Alexander followed, heart pounding, as they placed Benjamin into the small, portable crib and loaded him into the back of the ambulance. Sir, you can ride with us, one of the EMTs said. Alexander climbed in, his eyes never leaving his son. He didn't even realize he was still clutching the blanket until someone gently pulled it from his hands. The door slammed shut behind them and the vehicle roared to life. Inside, the machines beeped. Monitors flickered. The paramedics worked. With steady hands as they fought for the child's life, Alexander stared down at his son, at the small miracle he had just watched come back to life. Stay with me, he whispered. Just hang on. The ambulance tore through the city streets, sirens wailing like a cry for mercy. Inside, time moved differently, at once to fast and agonizingly slow. The newborn's chest rose and fell with the help of oxygen. His pulse was faint but steady. Alexander watched every flicker on the monitor, terrified it would flatline at any moment. We're almost there, one of the paramedics said. Alexander barely nodded, eyes locked on his son. His heart was thudding in his chest, not with fear now but with something else. Hope, raw, terrifying hope. The ambulance pulled into the hospital. Medical staff were already waiting, pediatric specialists, nurses, neonatal team. They rushed to the ambulance and immediately took over. Male infant, the paramedic shouted, was presumed dead 3 days ago. Spontaneous respiration detected by civilian. Weak pulse. Resuscitation initiated. They wheeled the baby into the emergency unit. Alexander tried to follow but was held back. Sir, please wait here, a nurse said gently. We'll update you as soon as we can. Alexander nodded, dazed. He collapsed into the nearest chair, his hands shaking. He stared at the swinging doors through which his son had just disappeared, and waited. Every second dragged like a century. He remembered Clara, her final words before they wheeled her into the operating room. We're going to meet our son soon. He had thought those words were the last thing she'd ever say. He thought she had died without knowing that baby had even lived for a moment. But now, maybe, just maybe, she had been right. Maybe this was their miracle, just delayed. Time passed. Alexander didn't know how long. Minutes, hours. Finally, a doctor approached. A woman in a white coat with a kind but serious face. Mr. Porter, she said. He jumped to his feet. Yes, I'm Dr. Adams. I'm the neonatologist overseeing your son. Alexander braced himself. She smiled gently. He was in an extremely weak state. Severe hypoxia, dehydration, and bradycardia, but he's stabilized. He's going to make it. Alexander's legs buckled. He grabbed the wall for support, and then he wept. Tears of joy, of disbelief, of overwhelming gratitude poured from him as the weight he had carried for days finally cracked under the light of hope. "My boy," he whispered. "My boy is alive." For several minutes, Alexander stood there in the hallway, barely able to process what had just happened. His baby had lived. The words echoed through his mind like a song, like a prayer answered after he'd long stopped praying. The son he had buried in his heart had come back to him, not imagined, not mistaken, alive. But when he finally sat down, his hands covered his face. Every second of the past 3 days replayed in his mind, the heartbreak, the numbness, the funeral arrangements, the silent porch, and then the small voice of a child cutting through the darkness. The boy. Eli, how could he have forgotten? Alexander bolted upright and turned to the nurse behind the desk. "I need to go, just for a moment, please." She nodded, sensing the urgency in his voice. "We'll call you if anything changes." He rushed out of the hospital, flagged down a cab, and gave his address. As they drove, his mind raced. The world had shifted under Alexander's feet, but the boy who caused that shift still sat quietly, unnoticed by anyone else but him. Eli hadn't moved from the porch. He was curled in on himself, as if trying to stay out of the way. Even after witnessing something so powerful, he didn't expect anyone to care. People didn't look twice at him, not in this part of the city, not ever. But Alexander Porter was no longer the man he had been before this day. As Alexander knelt before the boy again, he realized how small Eli truly was. His shirt was oversized, probably handed down or found, sleeves rolled awkwardly past his wrists. His shorts were torn, knees scabbed, and feet raw from walking without shoes. Yet his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, held something that neither pity nor privilege could erase. "You saved him," Alexander whispered. "You saw what no one else did. Not the doctors, not me. You knew." Eli said nothing. His hands were clenched in his lap, like he wasn't sure if he'd done something wrong. Alexander studied him closely. "Have you been out here all this time?" Eli nodded slowly. "Sometimes I sleep on the steps. Your porch is quiet, feels safe." Alexander blinked, stunned. He hadn't noticed, not once. In all his wealth, all his distractions, he'd never even seen the boy who had spent cold nights just feet away from his door. It struck him like a blow to the chest. He had been blind to so much, but not anymore. "Where are your parents, Eli?" Alexander asked gently. Eli looked away, his small frame tensing. "Don't know," he said simply. "I think my mom went to sleep and didn't wake up. That was a long time ago." Alexander's chest tightened. "And your dad?" Eli shook. His head never met him. A silence hung in the air, not awkward but heavy with understanding. Alexander didn't push. He knew that look in Eli's eyes, the look of someone who had survived too much, said too little, and learned never to expect anything from anyone. "I get food from the bakery trash," Eli offered after a pause. "Sometimes it's still warm." Alexander didn't know what to say. He was a man used to negotiating billion-dollar deals, convincing investors, charming crowds. But none of that had prepared him for this. This child, so alone, so forgotten by the world, had given him everything. Without Eli, Benjamin would be gone. Without Eli, Alexander would still be drowning in grief. "You should never have to live like that," Alexander finally said, voice trembling. "No one should." Eli gave a small shrug. "I'm used to it." But Alexander wasn't. Not anymore. Not after today. He looked the boy in the eyes, his voice steady now. "You're not going back out there. Not tonight. Not ever again." That evening, Alexander made calls to the authorities, to child services, to a friend at the city's child welfare office. He explained everything, from Eli's discovery to Benjamin's miraculous recovery. When the caseworker arrived, a young woman named Denise, she asked Eli a few gentle questions. The boy answered truthfully but cautiously. He had been through evaluations before, each time landing back on the street. Alexander didn't let that happen this time. "I want to take him in," he said firmly, "tonight and for as long as he'll let me." Denise raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Porter, fostering, let alone adoption, takes time. It's a process." "I know," he said, "and I'll follow every step. But I won't let him go back to the streets while we figure it out." She studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Eli, who stood quietly by the fireplace, wrapped in a clean towel, hair damp from a bath, wearing one of Alexander's oversized t-shirts like a nightgown. He looked so small but also, for the first time, safe. "We can authorize emergency placement for now," Denise finally said, "but we'll need to open a file." "Open whatever you need," Alexander said. "Just don't take him away." That night, Eli slept in a real bed for the first time in years. A warm bed, in a safe house, with full blankets and a soft pillow. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching the boy breathe. It reminded him of watching Benjamin's chest rise and fall in that tiny coffin, except now it was life and peace, not fear and grief. Everything was beginning again. Over the following weeks, The house that once echoed with sorrow began to fill with new sounds: footsteps down the stairs, laughter in the kitchen, the tapping of a spoon against a cereal bowl, the shuffle of toy blocks being built into towers. Eli adjusted quickly. Though he remained quiet at first, he was used to silence, used to waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Alexander kept his promise. No threats, no shouting, no locks, just warmth, food, comfort, and patience. And each day, the bond grew stronger. Alexander returned to the hospital daily, holding Benjamin in his arms. The baby's color had improved, his cries now stronger, his tiny fingers wrapping tightly around his father's thumb. Eli came with him most days. He stood by the crib, watching Benjamin with quiet awe. "He's so small," Eli whispered one day, eyes wide. "You were once that small too," Alexander said. "Really?" Eli's face scrunched up. Alexander laughed. "Absolutely. And one day Benjamin will be as big as you, and you'll be the one teaching him stuff." Eli looked down at the baby again and smiled. "I'll teach him how to spot things no one else sees." Alexander nodded. "You already have." On discharge day, both Alexander and Eli were there to bring him home. As Alexander strapped the newborn into the car seat, Eli watched carefully, absorbing every movement. And when they walked into the house together, baby in arms and boy at his side, Alexander realized that for the first time since Clara's death, the house felt alive again. Whole. 6 months later, the adoption papers were finalized. Eli Porter, the boy who had once been invisible to the world, was now the legally adopted son of one of the city's wealthiest men. More importantly, he was loved, protected, and finally, home. Benjamin, healthy and thriving, giggled as Eli tickled his feet on the living room rug. Alexander watched them from the doorway, his heart full. He thought of Clara, often her voice, her laugh, her dreams, and he believed she would be proud. Proud of Benjamin. Proud of Eli. And proud of the life they had built in the shadow of heartbreak. When people asked Alexander what had happened that day, why the funeral for his son never took place, and how he ended up with 2 boys instead of none, he would always smile softly and say, "There was a little boy barefoot, hungry, forgotten, who saw what no one else did. He saved my son's life. And in doing so, he gave me mine back too." Sometimes miracles don't come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes they come in tattered shirts and bare feet, with eyes that see the impossible. And when they do, all we have to do is listen. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us where in the world are you watching from. And always remember, kindness can come from the most unexpected places and sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest miracles. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep believing in second chances.